So then, moving right along then to the worldview of William Irwin Thompson. William Irwin Thompson is the only one of these thinkers still alive, as I mentioned earlier. I think he was born in 1939, and he's coming up on he's finishing up his Saturn return. He's in his early 60s, and he's had a good long career. He's written a whole stream of books. He sort of was born in L.A. and suffered through the childhood there, the sort of culturally deprived L.A. world, and then ended up going off to the East Coast to study there, got his degrees, got his Ph.D., then went to go teach English at MIT. He was often asked, why do you want to teach English to engineers? That's just sort of a waste of your time. His buddies in the humanities would ask him that. And he said, because I want to learn something about science, and I think it's at MIT that I can gain cosmological ideas that will inspire my poetry and my writing and so forth. He's also a kind of poet. But what he found at MIT was exactly the opposite. He draws a distinction between the Pythagorean scientist and the Archimedean scientist. He says the Pythagorean type of scientific thinker is interested in cosmological visions of how the universe fits together, exactly what we've been discussing here, that type. The Archimedean type, on the other hand, is interested in technology and in technological solutions to problems. The figure of Daedalus, the original sort of prototype of the Archimedean mentality, is the sort of prototypical myth of that. Daedalus is this sort of conscienceless problem solver who is on hand whenever a king needs him to solve a problem, regardless of what the moral consequences of that are. And so, in a certain sense, everyone's always getting into trouble because Daedalus can provide the machines. He can provide Pasiphae wants to have sex with the bull. He can provide the fake bull that she can hide in to have sex with the bull that generates the Minotaur. Now what do we do with the Minotaur? Well, Daedalus is on hand. He'll provide you with the labyrinth. So he builds the labyrinth that we put the Minotaur in, this shameful genetic freak. And they sort of put him in there. And then he ends up himself being put into that labyrinth along with his son. What does he do? He designs a couple of pairs of wings, and he and his son sail off, but he has told his son not to fly too high. And of course his son flies too high, it melts his wings, his son falls into the water. But Daedalus escapes from Crete to the mainland, into Sicily actually, and takes up residence there, solving problems for various kings. And meanwhile, the king that he's pissed off back in Crete has gone to look for him, and it just leads on and on into the series of misadventures. But that is the personification of the amoral, conscienceless scientist who is ready to solve technological problems without regard for whatever their moral consequences are going to be. And this is the kind of mentality that William Irwin Thompson said he encountered at MIT. These people who were just absolutely fascinated with technological solutions to the problems that we're facing nowadays, and didn't care about cosmology, didn't care about spiritual implications in the world that they were building. And this was also, after World War II, when the defense industries began to hijack the universities and pour all this money into the university system to train people to become, as it were, servants to the military. And this was the kind of world that MIT was still operating in, and probably still is to this day. So he just became fed up with MIT and left it. And this was at the very end of the 60s. In the late 60s, he left. He went out to Esalen. And in these days, Esalen had just been put up on the West Coast by Michael Murphy. And he sort of hung out there. And he traveled around the world to all these counterfoil institutions. The late 60s was the period of the emergence of the counterfoil institution. People began to realize that the defense industry hijacking the universities spelled out a bad thing for education, particularly the lack of a humanistic education. And so all these counter-institutions began springing up. You got out here Paolo Soleri working on his arcologies up in north of here. You got at that time the Sri Aurobindo Ashram was still going in Pondicherry, India. You had Krishnamurti floating around out here on the West Coast establishing Ojai. You got Green Gulch and all these places, Esalen. And Thompson just sort of traveled around visiting them, and then he decided, I'm going to sort of build my own counterfoil institution, and he called it Lindisfarne. So he named it after the, Lindisfarne was the first monastery that was sacked by the Vikings. It was the sort of Irish refuge, and the whole sort of Irish Celtic world would have been an incredible transformation of Christianity had these people survived, because they were at odds with the Catholic Church, and they were bringing in Celtic influences, this sort of Celtic mystical world, into traditional Christianity. And if that had not have been an abortive situation as a result of the Vikings, who just between 750 AD and 1050 AD began pouring down, raping, pillaging, slaughtering, and burning. And the first place that they destroyed was Lindisfarne. So he names his institution Lindisfarne as a counterfoil institution, sort of rooted in this Irish tradition of mysticism and poetry. Where he first set it up was out on the East Coast in New York in the Hamptons, and he set it there as a kind of place where people could come from all the different faiths and recognize common ground. But then he was becoming more and more, he'd always been interested in science, but he was becoming more and more interested in scientists rather than theologians or spiritual folk per se. So he went out to Colorado, out to the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and rebuilt Lindisfarne there, built this sort of gigantic chapel with this beautiful geometrical roof. And the floor was never finished because they never generated enough money, I think, to finish off the floor. And Thompson, for a while, sort of hooked up with these sacred geometers, these esotericists like Keith Critchlow and Kathleen Raine and so forth, at this time, whom he began to realize were living in the past, and that really bothered him. They wanted to go back to this geometrical mentality that we'll look at in a second, whereby there's this kind of masculine desire to escape from the feminine, escape from the body, escape from the world, into a world of masculine geometrical abstractions, which themselves are frozen geometries that have nothing to do with motion or time or birth and death and the whole world of wet biology. And he began to realize that these people were regressing to the past, and he was interested in the next new thing that was coming along. So he sort of left Lindisfarne, turned it over to a group of Zen monks, and then moved on. He wound up again after a period of time in New York City, where he taught for many years at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And he was there with Dean James Morton. And at this time, he began to hook up with really interesting scientist figures like Lynn Margulis, the microbiologist, and James Lovelock. These two had worked out the Gaia hypothesis, and they introduced it to him. And also the biologists Francisco Varela and the chaos theoretician Ralph Abraham. And I've interviewed three of these people in Twilight of the Clockwork God. And Thompson became fascinated with them because he began to see that the cosmology, the next new thing that was coming along, was coming out of this whole world that was being built by these marginalized thinkers. These were all thinkers who in a certain sense are academically respectable, because they've all been trained in the university world, they've all built up reputations there, but on the other hand, they've always been regarded with suspicion within those environments. It took Lynn Margulis a very, very long time for her theory of the emergence of the cell as a result of symbiosis of these smaller colonies of bacteria joining together to form the architecture of this cell that, is built, that we have in our bodies, that plants have. It took her years and years for that to get accepted by the scientific mentality. And once it was, they still regard her with suspicion with respect to the Gaia hypothesis, which is something you can't talk about in the academic culture world. But her and James Lovelock built as the sort of sky god. Lovelock was an atmospheric chemist who put together the Gaia hypothesis when NASA hired him to think about the problem of going to Mars and whether we could determine a priori it would be worth funding a mission to go to Mars if we could determine a priori somehow whether there was life on that planet. And he began to realize if he thought about the atmospheric constitution of Mars, it should be quite evident that there isn't any life on the planet, because all you have to do is look at the atmosphere of Mars, and what is it? It's almost all CO2, like burned automobile exhaust. The whole thing is just in a state of thermodynamic equilibrium. In other words, there's no potential for reactivity amongst the gases on Mars that you do find in our atmosphere, which is composed of mostly nitrogen, and you get oxygen at 21%, and it's maintained at 21%. If you increase the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere much over 21%, you'll get too many fires. If you decrease it, then life will begin to suffocate it. So what's maintaining this constancy of oxygen in the atmosphere at 21%? Well, it's plant life. The plants, of course, through photosynthesis, are shooting oxygen up into the atmosphere.